Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Monday's Live. We are very grateful to have you listening in today. I'm Elle Cole from the blog CleverlyChanging.com, and my blog is about finance, health, and wellness, and also parenting and homeschooling. I have a homeschool podcast that is found on most platforms that podcasts are played. It's called the Cleverly Changing podcast. And I would love for you to take a listen when you have an opportunity. The show airs bi-weekly. So you can go to CleverlyChanging.com and go to the top tab in black that says podcast and listen there, or find links to other places where you can listen. So thanks for joining us for today's Monday's Live.
Hi, and I'm Janus Adams. I have a website, janusadams.com. I publish a series of children's books and audios, but my overwhelming theme is history and healing. I'm really looking at how we can move beyond the history that we've been through and try to come to some place of peace for people, especially in the United States and worldwide, actually. I host my own show on public radio, and that is also available as a podcast. All of that you will find on my website, janusadams.com. And I love these Mondays that Elle and I get to share together with you, because we get to talk about some of the things that are kind of gnawing at us, that are not necessarily regularly a part of the national conversation. And I think that's what we're about to do today too.
Yes. I think what's great about our conversations is that it's an intergenerational conversation about current events, where I share my perspective from a youthful standpoint, because for much of what is going on, this is new to me. This is really outside my scope of the progression that I thought America was all about. And so I get to hear your thoughts from seeing this happen over many years, and you have more of a holistic view because this isn't your first time experiencing this. And so what I had viewed as progress, you know it to be something entirely different. This is the way America is. And so what I love about our conversations is in a time that we could feel upset and disturbed about the things, and we should be upset, you also provide context and understanding that helps to really place that rage. So we are just not, yelling at the top of our young lungs because we're like, where did this come from? You really help us to understand that although this isn't new, we cannot lose hope and we cannot give up. And so that is why I really relish these moments, because it does help provide calm in the midst of the storm. So thank you for that. Which is a great segue into today's conversation, because it's all about the calm in the midst of the storm. And you had a opportunity to be featured in a magazine. So I just want you to kind of give our viewers a chance to know what the magazine is about and how the honor has just impacted you.
Well, actually, thank you. The magazine is DV8 magazine. The Delaware Valley. It's the Delaware Valley, Hudson River Valley, the historic upstate New York region. That actually it is now the bedroom community to the bedroom communities that were a little further south in New York State, but a place that people for years have enjoyed coming up to as a retreat from New York City, as well as it combines the farming areas. And so you get many universities are here as well. But you get the perspective of when you're walking down the street in some of these small towns, you're getting the perspectives of the Bedrock people who've been here for their families, maybe for centuries, because they are descendant of the original colonists, and some are descendants of the farm communities, because New York State, as much as it's the Empire State, is really a farming community. And that's important because of the difference in perspectives then that you get from the people who are coming up from New York City and who have a more cosmopolitan view. And one of the things that I noticed during the last election was this amazing juxtaposition of people with the American flag sitting next to the Confederate flag in upstate New York. And I said, oh my goodness, what is this? Other than total confusion on their part, and not to be glib about it, but because it shows how little we all understand about our history. And to be quite honest, if there is any monument to the Confederacy that is with us all, it is the miseducation that we have all been through in the name of the American curriculum. And here you have people in the North, white people in the North, who are descendant of people who've been here for at least a century, and they don't even understand that in the North, I don't even think you could find 1% of the families that date back in the North that did not lose someone to the Civil War, because the Civil War was that extraordinary in terms of the amount of the population that was killed from that war. And here they are flying the flag of the traitors who created the war. So we all have a lot to look at and to heal from in terms of American history.
So what you just touched on, I think about growing up in the South and learning history. What's unique about my background is, although I went to public school, my mom really valued education. And I had a cousin, I believe, who owned a Black bookstore. So I was always provided with books outside of the history I received in school that taught me about American history. And when I reflect on what I learned in the past about the Civil War and slavery here in America, although slaves left from the South and went to the North wasn't completely blameless as we like to view it, as history and as TV tends to paint it.
In no way was it blameless. In zero ways was it blameless.
And so growing up, I would learn that there were bounty hunters. There were people in the North who would sell slaves back to the South. And so even in the North, although it was a safer place than being in the South in many instances, it definitely had its terrors, and it was still a place where Black people weren't completely free. So our view of freedom and our view of Harriet Tubman taking slaves through the Underground Railroad, there was a reason why she had dedicated people to help her, and she worked with the Quakers, because she still had to be secretive even as she was traveling into the North. And so, can you speak on that?
Well, yeah, I want to go back to something though. When I say the North is zero blameless, it's because we know last year we commemorated the 400th year since the first documented boatload of Africans were forced to these shores, 1619. Well, from that point on, enslavement happened North and South. So slavery took place just as much in the North for 200 years as it did in the South. in New York State, slavery isn't outlawed until 1827, January 1st, 1827, or January 1st, 1826. But still, that's still 200 years of it taking place. And then after that, the New York State specifically, the whole North was the industrialized North. New York is the economic capital. At one point, New York was favoring the Confederacy because they didn't want their money messed with. But even before that, when we talk about the North versus the South, yes, slavery ended earlier in the North than in the South, but only on average 40 to 50 years in a 246-year span. So that's relatively very little. And it is important to understand that the commerce, the whips, lashes, chains used to enforce enslavement were made in the North and shipped to the South. There was a huge economic gain for the North to still support the South. That is something that we see in other ways where the habit of that is taking place well into the late 20th century, where you have all of these Northerners saying, well, we don't want to insult the South because we need their votes. It still carries on. We have one other thing that I want to just mention very quickly in the historical context, is that 1619, when those first Africans are brought, they are called indentures like the whites because there's no other category for them. But by 1643, the first state colony to legalize slavery and call it so is Massachusetts. At one point, Connecticut was the largest slave state. So there is zero innocent about the North. After the 1850 compromise, the North allows the South to put everyone nationwide in service of slave owners. And even when slavery is finally defeated, those who are compensated are the former slaveholders for the loss of their property, Black people, and Black people are left on their own devices with nothing. Very few got the 40 acres or the mule, and most of those who did, it was taken away by the fall of 1865 after the death of Abraham Lincoln. So we have to understand this country is, land of the free, home of the brave may be a great slogan. It may be a wonderful aspiration, but it in no way has ever coincided with fact. And if we think it was bad for us as Black people, then, oh my goodness, what do we say to Indigenous people, to Native Americans?
Absolutely. What you said, you really broke it down, because we did a podcast, or a conversation about Juneteenth, and what really struck me was some people failed to understand when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, when Juneteenth happened, and then when the 13th Amendment was passed. All of those are three different events that really impacted Black people who were enslaved here in America. And I think, just for context, it's important for people to research and understand those three different
events over a 3-year period too, because Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation September 22nd, 1862. It goes into effect January 1st, 1863. The war continues until 1865, through pretty much April of 1865 with his assassination. So, and then Juneteenth is June 19th of 1865. And then the Freedom Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments don't happen until 1866 into 1867. So it is really a 4-year period that you're talking about, 4 years that intersect with the 246 years, so it makes it a 248-year history. And that that period, from the time the Emancipation Proclamation was issued through the time that it actually had practical application at the end of the war, what many people don't understand as well is that it freed, it was a war strategy, so that it only freed people in the states in rebellion, which is the way
Correct.
it was worded. And so people who were still enslaved or held somehow in bounds in the states not in rebellion were not officially free until after the Civil War's end. And as well, it's important to understand that what we see when we have, let's add to that, since we're talking not just about the Civil War and slavery, but we're talking about the ongoing history, it's important to add the neo-slavery that comes back in the form of Jim Crow and so-called legal segregation, which is completely designed to undermine the Constitution that has been put in place. So the respect of this country for its own Constitution is not great either. When it goes through many of the things that it goes through. We basically have not received what we fought for. We have not gotten our blood and money's worth from the Constitution or the bills that have been proposed, or the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. All these things, somehow the United States has found to always make negotiable. That's the problem that we have to look at. And that's the problem that we have to see clearly right now in 2020, that we are once again being made negotiable. So those people who are out there on the street, and thank goodness they are, I have been, I'm sure you've been with your children, you've taken the kids to understand what is going on now. Those people who are adamantly on the street, you'll hear a lot of conservative voices saying, well, why don't you talk about COVID in terms of those people? Well, one of the reasons we don't is because when we hit the street for Black Lives Matter, we know that whether it is COVID or George Floyd demonstrations, it is life and death for us either way. So that is what we are fighting for right now, is these are life and death issues. It's not some taxes and tea in a harbor. It is our life and death.
It's so important what you just mentioned, because it's like we're also seeing a resurgence in Black people running for office. And right now, so back in the day, after those major 3 events happened, there was a period called the Reconstruction Period. Exactly. And there were many Black men who ran for office and ran. So just like they had that back then, what we're seeing now is Black women running. We're seeing a lot of Black women, and Indigenous women are also running. And so this is kind of like, we just had a lot of women accepted into to the Senate. And so we're seeing
voted into Congress. It was a wave of women in post Donald Trump who were voted in the midterm elections, which was an unprecedented number of women and of people of color in one election.
Right. And now we're seeing that again, because we have an election coming up and we're seeing a record number of women who are running for office again. And so with those two events happening, it's almost like, you know, history, we say history is repeating itself, but I definitely see that. And as a young person, it's almost eerie. It's like, oh, wow, you know, because there is this period of knowing, but it's almost like we're having to relearn what happened in the past.
Yes.
Because of what you just mentioned. In the schools, they weren't necessarily teaching what had actually happened in the history books. So it's like people see this as an unprecedented time, like it's all new, but it's not all new. And so,
yeah.
So you, in the article, you were talking about Donald Trump and him being elected for the first time, and how that kind of impacts us, and you know, the feelings that you felt around seeing the flags and everything. And so it just makes me think, what is history telling us about the now that we're living in, and how do we cope with that? And I feel like you, in the article, you touched on all of those things, how you have learned to cope personally with the news and with knowing the history, because it's one thing to live every day and not be familiar with these signs of history repeating itself. It's a whole nother thing to be fully aware and say, wow, you know, how far have we really come, and be able to really process that from a place of knowledge and wisdom.
You know, a couple of things that you touched on, which are so key to what we're experiencing now. I'll start with the last one, when you refer to what progress really is there. For many historians will call this the Second Reconstruction, because just the way we came out of the Civil War and we had the Freedom Amendments, then we came out a century later, we're still fighting for freedom, and we come out of the Civil Rights Movement rather than the Civil War, but the Civil Rights Movement, and we have a series of civil rights amendments that take place that are being threatened every day. In fact, they're being dismantled actively. So not only do we have the Second Reconstruction in terms of the progress forward, but we are experiencing a second era of Plessy versus Ferguson that is so dangerous, especially as Republicans keep talking about, we need this, the real thing is the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court is the one that was filled with slave owners, previous slave owners, or people men descendant of that, white men descendant of that, who legalized Plessy versus Ferguson, which undermined everything from a human rights standpoint that those freedom amendments to the Constitution were meant to protect. It is because of Plessy versus Ferguson legalizing segregation, unleashing the wave of terror that was the era of segregation in this country. And lynchings were only part of it. Lynchings were the most visible, egregious part of it. But there were other things going on. People were, the destruction of our ability to earn a living. You know, people will say, well, why don't you own a business? But the machinations that took place to say, even if you do own a business, we will do with you as you please. This is coming up on the centennial in next year of the Tulsa Riots, in which a mob of whites marauded through the Black community and destroyed what was then called Black Wall Street because it was too prosperous, and they thought it was considered, they thought of it as a threat to them. Not only did they maraud through, they killed thousands of people. They left 10,000 people homeless in 2 days, and no one has ever been sanctioned or paid the price for the damage done to that Black community. no justice, no reparation, no anything, except for now to say, well, yeah, it happened and wasn't that terrible, and at least we'll commemorate the fact that it happened. But the families that went through that and the terror that that wreaked on communities throughout the nation, and the license that it gave racist whites throughout the nation, whether they rioted or they did not riot, it still gave them license to tell them, to lead up to the point systemically where we know we had Rodney King, and Rodney King wasn't enough. We know that we had Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin wasn't enough. Somehow, the perfect storm happens with George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd. But that police officer, Derek Chauvin, had been educated to know that he could get away with that since Plessy versus Ferguson was put in place in 1896. He had been told, nothing's going to happen. We do nothing when this kind of thing happens. We sanction it. We say we believe in our police. And we should believe in everybody who is working hard to make sure our civilization works and supports us all. We should support everybody who does that. But when people violate that, and people that we entrust to protect us with literally given a license to kill and use it with impunity, that's what these George Floyd demonstrations are about. And it is also about saying no to ending the Second Reconstruction. It is about saying no to the dismantling of the protections like the Voting Rights Amendment and Equal Housing Amendment and all of those human rights provisions that we worked and fought and died so hard for, that John Lewis, among others, but most notably John Lewis, was beaten over the head and left to die for. Come on, people. This is what you want to excuse and go back to? So that's what we're looking at now, and why, and it is important to see the cycles of our history. It is not comfortable and it is not comforting. And in the midst of that, we do have to make space for our own personal sanity. We do. And that is the point at which, you know, we can go on about the horrors, and we must not forget the horrors, and we must not forget our responsibility to countermand those horrors with whatever means necessary, our civil disobedience, our democratic participation, our whatever we have to do to make sure that we understand as a country, we cannot go back to that, we have to do. But in the midst of doing that, we must also take time for self-regard. We must also take time for healing. We must also take time for self-respect. We must also take time to reach out and say, my dear sister, I love you. I'm so happy we get to spend these times together. To our audience, the same thing. That is equally important because it's the only way we're going to survive.
Absolutely. I think that you mentioned something in the article that I would love for us to end on, that I think is powerful, and what I have relied on to make it through each day, knowing what is going on. And that's everyone has a role. So everyone's role is not going to be protesting. No. And that is okay. And in the article, you mentioned about Representative John Lewis, who he just passed. So for those of you who would like to learn more about that, you can listen to one of our earlier conversations. But you just, in the article, you mentioned that he was protesting, but there was someone there to
Oh,
help him.
my goodness. You know, at the height of the civil rights movement, J. Edgar Hoover calls Dr. King the most dangerous man in America. And the movement was dangerous because it empowered people. A country that wanted huge swaths of people to shrink in fear and to say, no, we can't. And thank you, you know, great master, for one P that you put on our plate more than the other P, you know? No. The civil rights movement was, if it did anything, it empowered people to demand justice. So maybe you could not be the one on the front line. I mean, the bestial behavior of these white people, not only pouring ketchup on people's heads at a lunch counter, but putting cigarettes out on their backs. That's the depravity that we're talking about. Maybe you couldn't do that, but you could be the one, or maybe you couldn't be the one like John Lewis and Hosea Williams to be literally on the front line of the front line, leading the march. But then you could be the one who could bandage them and get them away. And let us not forget that this was the era in which Black people were not allowed into hospitals, and the hospitals that they tried to create on their own were few and far between, because we just didn't have the wherewithal to make sure there was one in every major community. So maybe you couldn't be John Lewis or Hosea Williams, but you could be the one who could drag them away from there and get them bandaged up and heal them. Maybe you couldn't tolerate the blood and the gore of what was going on, but maybe you were the one who prepared the sandwiches and the lunches that the marchers took out with them that day. Maybe you could not do that, but you could be the one who just looked out for their kids while they went out. Whatever you could do, there was a place for you, as long as your heart and your mind were stayed on freedom and in the right place. That is what we have to do now. That is what I mean when I say by any means necessary. Whatever you have that you can bring to the cause of justice, bring your A game, whatever it is. You know, many of these mass demonstrations, one of the things that after the March on Washington took place, they made a big thing of being surprised at how well the mall was left, and how, you know, appropriate after all the hell they put us through to get there. Congress even closed for the day because they were terrified of what Black people might do to them. They were terrified of the do unto us as we have done unto you. That's what they were terrified of. But we didn't. And the mall was left in beautiful shape, as well as could be possibly expected when 250,000 people show up in one place. That has been kind of a hallmark of these movements too. Yes, there are some people who have just gone berserk from the pressure and have rioted or who, whatever. But you also see the videos of one man looking at a younger man and an older man, and the younger man is saying to the older man, you can't explode now. You just can't explode now, because what are we going to tell this young guy right behind you? You've got to hold on for this young one. We have those things to look. That's another moment of maybe you can't, but this is what you can do. That is, it's life affirming, life changing, and life sustaining.
Absolutely. Well, I think this has been another incredible conversation that, you know, we just have an opportunity to learn from you and your knowledge, and you really broke it down so that we could understand more what is taking place in America and what do we do now. So thank you for the encouragement and for really just being honest with us about the past and your feelings that you're facing now. So thank you.
Thank you. And can I just say one more thing about what do we do now? From now until November, almost the easiest thing that we can do is vote. And they are the people who are determined to try to keep this country on its racist, sexist, horrific course are doing everything they can. Don't let them do it. If they make you run through hoops to vote, run through the hoops. If they make you say, well, you need not one form of ID, now you need two. Not only do you get the two forms of ID, but the neighbor who doesn't have one, you get in your car and you drive that neighbor to help them get one. Whatever it takes, because they're desperate and they're determined that their ill-gotten gain of a way of life, they don't want to lose. Well, we don't want to lose our lives either. And we know from our history, we know from our ancestors, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. We just will not do it. So vote, but make sure your neighbor does too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's all, folks.
That's all, folks.
Please share this conversation with someone else. All right. Bye.
Thank you for being with us today. I'm Janus Adams, and
I'm Elle Cole.
goodbye now.